Well, hello everybody. Welcome to Chef's Baking Blog. Today I'm going to make apple turnovers. So little squares of puff pastry with apple put onto them and then folded in half to make triangles and baked in the oven. These are actually very easy to make, particularly if you use shop-bought puff pastry. But if you're going to do that, I suggest you buy what we call all butter puff pastry, so that it's made with butter rather than hydrogenated oil. I'm going to use puff pastry which I've made myself, and I'm going to use about 300 grams of that, but one sheet of shop bought puff pastry should be enough for this recipe. So I'll go on to the ingredients, and this is my puff pastry, and I'm only going to use half of that, and I will roll that out into a sheet, and I will tell you the details of that later. So then I have 2 apples here, decent sized apples, and I'm using Granny Smith's, and I've cut them into small pieces, and I've actually squeezed some lemon juice over them and tossed them in the lemon juice to stop them from browning. So that's 2 apples. You can use whatever apples you like, but it's better to use ones which don't disintegrate when they're being cooked. I have 50 grams, a quarter of a cup of light brown sugar, 28 grams, 2 tablespoons of unsalted butter, which I have cut into small cubes. I'm going to use 1 medium egg, which would be large in the USA, but 1 egg beaten to brush over the top and to seal the pastry. I have just a pinch of cinnamon, and that's optional. If you don't like cinnamon with your apples, you don't have to use it. And then I have a little bit of granulated sugar, maybe 2 teaspoons, and that's going to be sprinkled over the top. So the first thing I'm going to do is to cook these apples until they're soft, but they still retain their shape, and then they need to cool down before we can actually use them in the puff pastry. And the apples are going to be cooked in the butter and the sugar and the cinnamon. So you can do this in a saucepan, but I'm going to do it in my saucier on a sort of medium to low heat. So I'll put the butter in and turn the heat on, and I'm going to add the sugar as well and sprinkle over the cinnamon at that stage. And then put the apples in, and I want the butter to melt, the sugar to dissolve, and the apples to soften, so that a knife poked into them can go in quite easily, but everything hasn't disintegrated. And that's going to take 8 to 10 minutes, and I will actually cover my apples and let them simmer away once the butter and the sugar has melted. And then I'll give them a stir occasionally, just to make sure that nothing's sticking to the bottom and that the heat isn't getting too much. Now you could use water instead of the butter if you wanted to, but I think the butter with the sugar gives a nice caramelly flavour to the apples. So my butter and sugar have melted now, and I'm actually going to cover those and just check every couple of minutes and give them a stir until they've gone soft enough that a knife can poke into them quite easily. So the apple has softened, and I can poke a knife in very easily. So I'm going to turn that off, and most of the juice has also evaporated, as you can see. So I'm going to put the apples into a bowl like that, and I'm going to allow those to cool. So I'll leave them for a few minutes, then I'll cover them and put them in the fridge, and they will cool down that bit quicker. and once they're completely cooled down, I will come back and we'll go on to the next stage, which is to cut out pastry into squares and fill it and then bake it. As the apple cools down, I'm going to roll my pastry out, and here I have my 300 grams or thereabouts, and I want to roll that out to a rectangle which is about 14.5 inches by 10 inches, and then I'm going to trim off the edges to square it down to 13.5 by 9 basically. 14.5 by 10 is 37 centimetres by 25 centimetres. I've floured the work surface. Now, if you have shop bought pastry, lay it flat and measure it, and it may just about be the right size, but if it's not, just roll it out a little bit thinner to get it to the right size, because we're going to divide it into 6 4.5 inch squares. So what I'm going to do, having rolled mine out quite roughly to the size I need, I'm going to trim off the edges. And then I'm going to measure from that straight edge down to my 13.5 inches that I need. Which is there. I'm going to cut that off. And then I want my 9-inch depth, which I will then divide in two, of course, and the 9 inches is 23 centimetres, but I'll just measure that. I'll straighten one edge and measure the 9 inches from that straightened edge, and that's actually going to be good enough. So then I'm going to divide that in two, whoops, did that wrong. And divide each of these into 3. And then with each of those divided like that, I'm going to put them onto a baking tray and I'm going to chill them. I've put those onto a baking tray and I'm going to put them into the fridge and I'm going to chill them. And as they're chilling, I'm going to preheat my oven to 200 Celsius, that's 180 Celsius with a fan, 400 Fahrenheit, and that would be the temperature that I want the oven to be at when these go in, but then I will reduce the temperature a little bit for baking, and the reduced temperature will be 180 Celsius, 160 Celsius with a fan, 350 Fahrenheit. But I'll remind you of that when they go in the oven. So my oven is preheated now, and I've taken the chilled pastry back out of the fridge and the apple, which has cooled down. So I'm going to take each square in turn like that, and I'm going to brush it with some of the egg which I have beaten, and I'm going to brush round the edges like that, and then I'm going to take about a tablespoon of the apple and put it into the middle. I don't need any more than that. And I'm going to take one corner and I'm going to bring it over and press it down onto the other corner, and I'm going to press the edges down as well. Like that, to seal them. And then I'm going to take a fork. You could do another way of sealing them, but I'm just going to press the edges together with a fork, like that, and put it back onto a baking tray which is lined with parchment paper, and do the same for the remainder. And then with them on the baking tray like that, I'm going to brush over the top, but not around the seam, because I think the egg may inhibit the seam from rising. And with the tops brushed with the egg white, the egg wash, like that, I'm then going to take a sharp knife and I'm going to make a couple of slits in the top of each one. You can do 2 or 3 if you want, and this is to let the steam out as they bake, so that the pastry crisps up. I do 3 on this one. Like that. And then I'm going to put those into the oven, and as soon as they go into the oven, I'm going to reduce the temperature to 180 Celsius, that's 160 Celsius with a fan, 350 Fahrenheit, and I'm going to bake them for about 35 to 40 minutes until they've puffed up and they've got a nice golden colour on top. We have to make sure that they're baked all the way through so that the pastry isn't soggy in the middle. So once they've baked for that 35 to 40 minutes, I take them out and allow them to cool down for a couple of minutes, then transfer them to a wire rack to cool down more. I don't want to eat them as soon as they come out of the oven, because that apple is going to be red hot inside. So I'll come back when they've cooled down and I'll show you the results. I baked the apple turnovers for 35 minutes and I took them out of the oven and put them onto a wire rack, and they're still cooling down. Now I should say that I forgot to put the sugar, sprinkle the sugar over the top. So they'd been in the oven for about a minute and I took them out and sprinkled the sugar over the top. You don't have to do that, but I did that. And they baked quite nicely. So this is what they look like. And they've puffed up, as you can see, very nicely there. And I've cut one open, and this is what it looks like inside, if you can see that. So I'll have a taste of it, if it's not too hot. The lovely flakes of puff pastry, they just collapse as you bite into them. The apple has a tartness to it because these were Granny Smiths. You could add a little bit more sugar if you want to, and if you're using a different type of apple which is sweeter anyway, you may not want to add quite so much sugar. But I like the tartness in the Granny Smith apples, so this is perfect for me. So that's going to be it for this recipe. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have, please give me the thumbs up below the video and click to subscribe to my YouTube channel. In the top right hand corner of the screen there will be an eye that you can click on, and that will take you to a link for the recipe, and I'll put a link below the video as well, and I'll be back with another recipe in the very near future. So until then, happy baking.